So welcome everybody to the Build Back Fairer International High-Level Public Policy Panel. We'll wait a few seconds until we start. So I hope the technical issues are set. Welcome everybody to this exciting international live debate on Build Back Fairer. Tomorrow is World Fair Trade Day. It is celebrated globally every second Saturday of May. And it is an opportunity for the fair trade movement to celebrate Fair Trade Day, to take stock about what has been achieved, and to look forward into what still needs to be done for all trade to be fair. My name is Sergi Corbalan. I'm the director of the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, a joint fair trade movement initiative, and I'm based in Brussels. Before going on with this event, we would like to express our solidarity with all the people that are suffering these days because of the COVID pandemic. We've just heard of some updates from the Philippines, from Ecuador, from India, and from many other countries, and we know these are not easy situations. In that context, talking about celebrations on World Fair Trade Day, it's a bit kind of with mixed feelings that we do it. Yet we express our solidarity to all those that are suffering and hoping that we actually take some lessons from COVID. And this will be one of the key topics that we'll be discussing today. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panelist of this event. And I'm honored to welcome Mr. Daniel Legarda, who's Vice Minister of International Trade of Ecuador, who will be speaking. Thanks for joining, Mr. Legarda. Ecuador is one of the countries that has most progressive fair trade policies since many years, and we'll hear more about that. Mr. Legarda is also accompanied by Mrs. Miho Shirotori, who's acting director at the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD. UNCTAD is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development based in Geneva. And thanks for joining. We're also very pleased to have Ms. Louise Luttikholt from IFOAM-Organics International, which is the International Association of Organic Agriculture Organizations based in Bonn in Germany. And we're also very pleased to have with us Lisa Dacanay, the president of the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, which is a consortium of social enterprises, researchers, academics working on social entrepreneurship in Asia. And she's joining us from Bazan in the Philippines. And last but not least, pleased to welcome Erinch Sahan, the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization. So how will this panel work? We're going to try to make it participatory. So we've asked panelists not to make very long interventions. We will start with one question around the lessons learned in relation to COVID, where each panelist will speak. Then we'll have another question about the role of governments in putting policies in putting in place the right policies in relation to a just and sustainable recovery after the pandemic. And then we'll allow for a time for questions from the audience for clarification, where we will invite you to write your questions on the platform that you're watching this event. So if you're watching on Facebook, you can write your comment on Facebook. If you're watching on YouTube, you can write it on YouTube. And then internally, the team, we will collect the answers and try the questions and try to pick and to raise them to the panelists as much as possible. When you ask questions for clarification, please just mention your name, your country, and also if there is a question that is for somebody specific or it's for all the panel. And then after we've dealt with these questions for clarification, then we will be able to open up more like a debate format, where if you have other suggestions or reactions to what has been said by the panelist, it will be possible both in the panel and also with the inputs and questions or comments from the audience. And then I will make sure that we conclude in time so that nobody's weekend starts too late. So I hope it is clear. And there are no questions, and I hope that everybody can listen in well and watch in a good way. So if that's the case, then I'm gonna just as a quick reminder that of why we're doing this debate and why we call it Build Back Fairer. In September already last year, a number of civil society networks came together and we said, we cannot continue the business as usual. The COVID is a symptom that things are wrong. Not everything is wrong, but basically that there are some failures in the trade and economic system, and we need to take stock, and we need governments as partners to actually change the rules of the game and the economy and trade. So therefore, with a wide number of civil society organizations, which we could not all invite to participate in the panel because it would have been too much, we signed a Build Back Fairer statement, which I invite you to look online. We have also produced a video. And this Build Back Fairer statement tries to identify some of the analysis of what is wrong with the current dominant economic and trade system and proposing measures of what governments could do. It is signed by many international organizations, international civil society and private sector actors like the International Cooperative Alliance, like RIPES, the Social and Solidarity Economy Network, like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, like CITSE, the Catholic Development NGO networks, and obviously IFOAM-Organics International, and Social Economy Europe, and ACT Alliance, and I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. In any case, I invite you to check it online. So this was a way to introduce the topic. So I'm going to be starting the first panel with asking Mr. Legarda, in your view, Mr. Legarda, what do we learn actually from COVID and the COVID pandemic?
Well, thank you very much, Sergi. It's for me a pleasure to be here representing the government of Ecuador and my country, and of course share with all this important panel internationally. I haven't met anyone who's here, but I'm honored to share this panel with each one of these panelists. So regarding your question, Ecuador definitely it's an important actor in terms of fair trade and all that it means worldwide, not only in the region, but worldwide definitely. And we've seen the value of fair trade and all that implies even more in the pandemic, in these times of pandemics. What I would say is, even though there's a lot of things that I think we can learn from this crisis, but regarding trade and consumption and the consumers around the world, I would say that the one thing that we have learned is not something new, but I would say it has been raised by this crisis, is that people everywhere in the world can stop buying consumer goods such as cars, such as textile products, such as any kind of products, but people cannot stop eating. People cannot stop having food for their families, for themselves and everything. And this can sound very simple as well, but in times of pandemics, in times of crisis, it highlights a lot. So this is something that we definitely learned. And once this is said, the implications around this postulate is that the world needs to be prepared better for this kind of things happening in the world. And I can say proudly now, seeing at the numbers and seeing behind at this time, that my country was prepared, definitely, and that is something that has helped us in this case to um, uh, make this time a little bit better, or at least to not having the such as bad effects of the crisis. Everyone's affected, but I mean this has been kind of help for us in terms of what this production uh, signifies for Ecuador. Um, I would say that, for example, for in Ecuador, the export of our products, non-oil exports for our products, which are 80% mainly food prepared and fresh foods, around 80%. And last year was one of the few countries, at least in Latin America, that actually grew their exports, their non-oil exports, even with pandemics. We had a growth of about 10% even on our non-oil exports, even though the imports around the world, actually our imports decreasing more than 20%, but our exports rise 10%. And many of this was because, well, people needed to still have some food and food in their tables and their families and everything. Of course, there's a challenges behind this. There's been an important thing, I would say, mainly on security aspects. Ecuador was also one of the first countries hit by the pandemics in Latin America. And at the beginning of the pandemics last year was images around the world about what was happening in the streets of one of the cities here in Ecuador. And of course, that frightened people, that bring a lot of attention badly in a bad way. And people start worrying about, well, how's the safety in terms of the food, and how is this coming to my country? Is it complying with all the rules, with all the traceability, and with all the standards that I need to be sure of? And we make sure that that was the message right sent to the world. This was not easy to do, because people around the world was so afraid of it. But we did a major job in help with the government, with the private sector, and of course with international organizations, and along also with the health organization, about saying that, okay, the security is guaranteed. The enterprises already accomplished many of the standards that we need to make sure that the products get with quality, with safety, and with no problem at all. There's no risk of contracting COVID for having these products or for eating this food. But this was something that was needed to be repeated in several ways. The second one was logistics. It was also a challenge, not only in Ecuador but around the world. Logistics, the chains kind of interrupted in some way, but we managed our way also to find a way to not interrupt the export chains here in Ecuador. It took us like 1.5 months to put all the pieces together again here, ports, the logistic chain as a whole, but we did work, and with international actors, of course. And then the actors were able, most of them were able to also follow the shifts in demand, because the demand, even though people kept on demanding food products, the demand also shifted from one channel to others. And this was something that most of the producers and enterprises was also able to change, to adapt to these changes in shift. And that's why I think those are the three mainly factors that were positive in terms of what we have achieved in this last year from pandemics. But definitely, I would say that's the main thing that we can learn from this, and that we need to keep working together through these wars. I can resume this in the word resilience, which is something that we have seen, and that we need to go into deeper in the next years.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Louise Luttikholt from IFOAM-Organics International, how does that resonate to you? What would be the main lesson learned that you see from your sector?
Well, thanks a lot for asking this question, and thanks a lot, Daniel, for bringing up agriculture, because indeed that's been so important at the COVID pandemic, where we're still in, that people actually realize that food and food production is at the center of everything. And so we learn, of course, from the pandemic, the sad news that people have been dying. We've also seen that people are suffering actually from the measures that have been taken immediately at the beginning of the pandemic, that works have been closed down, that agriculture facilities have been closed down, and the people who suffer most from them are those who are worst based, who have less education, and who are at the, if you like, bottom of the pyramid. And I'm saying this with all respect because these are actually the people who normally help produce the food for our living. But what the crisis also has done, and maybe that is also a sort of good news, is that we have gotten new pair of glasses, new lenses, and also it provided us a moment for reflection because it revealed actually the vulnerability of the global food systems. And I'm impressed to hear from you, Daniel, how your country coped with that. But basically, from our perspective, we also need to conclude that organic agriculture drives some of those things. They drive habitat loss. Industrial agriculture drives habitat loss. It helps create the conditions, and I'm saying this carefully, but it does help create the conditions for viruses to emerge and spread in the first place. And that actually in a world where already millions of people are already living with hunger and malnutrition and extreme poverty. And as said, those are the people who have suffered most. So as you already said in your introduction, Sergi, there can only be this conclusion that we need to transition to sustainable and resilient food systems right now and not something for afterwards. So that's why we are also supporting the Build Back Better and fairer, I should say. And the interesting thing and the good thing also is that we have seen and learned that building on the experiences, for instance, in the organic agriculture sector and in the fair trade sector, in local food systems, we can already see something of this transformation coming. And we are also happy to offer our experiences so that others can also build on that. A wonderful example actually from Ecuador is that in the city of Quito, there's a lot of possibility for direct local food systems. And I think that has also helped the country recovering. So for me, that is the biggest lesson of the COVID situation, that it provided us with a perspective that we need to change very fast and that the building blocks for it are already there. So far for my introduction and statement.
Thank you, Louise. That was very interesting. I had a discussion the other day, somebody that said, why do you refer to fair trade, social enterprises, and organics as alternatives? You should call it time capsules, he said. And he said, it's about actually simply doing things before the others. It's about showing that it is actually the model for the future to produce in a sustainable way, to give decent work conditions, to pay correctly to farmers, and actually we need to make that the norm. We need to stop being an alternative so that it becomes mainstream, right? Anyway, so you made me think about that that point. Now I'd like to ask Lisa Dacanay from ICEA, what from your perspective of social entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurship in Asia, what would be the lesson learned from the pandemic?
Yes. Thank you, Sergi. I think building on what has already been stated by our panelists about the importance of sustainable and resilient food systems, I think the pandemic exposed the vulnerability of communities, no? Especially the poor and marginalized sectors, to pandemics, and the importance of social enterprises as their partners in ensuring food security, in ensuring resilience, and as partners in building back fairer. While overall, I think there was a lot of hunger that was experienced by the poor and marginalized, and a lot of poor and marginalized were actually dependent on government for relief. Yeah. A study that we did, a social enterprise action research study that we did, showed that the poor and marginalized sectors that have been engaged in farmers cooperatives, in social enterprises, in fair trade organizations, were actually better able to cope with the pandemic. And the reason for that is that I think social enterprises and fair trade organizations have already been building more resilient value chains and more resilient ways of life. Yeah. For example, farmers cooperatives didn't have to go hungry because even as they were serving as supplier communities to agricultural value chains that were not necessarily producing, that were not necessarily in food. Yeah. They had also diversified their farms to ensure food security even before the pandemic. No? So that during the pandemic, these farmers cooperatives and their households were actually not going hungry. They were actually they were food secure, and in that sense they were able to help the adjacent communities to be more food secure. For example, also those the poor and marginalized that had been engaged in savings and credit programs, no, and in capital build-up programs were able to draw from those savings, or those in cooperatives were able to draw from dividends, no, that they were able to use during the pandemic. And then among women, no, women stakeholders of social enterprises that had already implemented gender and development programs, they didn't really experience, the usual burden that most women feel with, with unpaid care work. And because of the gender and development programs that have been implemented, the women were actually, the men as well as the children were sharing in the household work and care work of the family. Now, so on the whole, I think while the pandemic was it was actually showing a lot of vulnerabilities on one hand, it showed a lot of hope. I think that social enterprises and fair trade organizations are actually a wave of the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this hopeful message. So now I'd like to give the floor to Miho from UNCTAD. What would be the main lesson learned that you see from UNCTAD in relation to COVID pandemic?
Thank you, Serge. First of all, you know that how happy we are to participate, and I'm very happy to participate in this session on behalf of the Acting Secretary General of UNCTAD, Madame Isabelle Durand, and happy that we actually continue our partnership and collaboration in this field that is very important for inclusive and sustainable economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Serge, to your question, I have to say that we consider that at this moment it's a bit too early to talk about the lesson as the situation is still evolving. But at least we can really highlight on the thing that really stood out during the COVID-19 crisis and something that we are really focusing on. That is the fact that I think we all agree the COVID-19 crisis, or this global scale of demand and supply shock, actually attacked hardest the ones with underlying weakness. And in this context, what I can say is that we really realize once again that the size matters in mitigating the shocks of this kind of global scale. For instance, in international trade, but of course in local trade, the smaller local operators, including the fair trade operators, producers, and services providers, received much larger and more prolonged financial blows than bigger global operators experienced. You know, on this, I mean, this is probably obvious, but sometimes it really helps to see this as a visual image in front of you to fully understand the magnitude of it. Recently, UNCTAD released this COVID-19 impact data portal that presents the most updated data, such as this, the one that updated in March 2021. And one of the data is on the impact of pandemic on firms by size. It's based on a survey of over 35,000 firms from 40 countries. Now, this is quite significant information to show. There are 3 questions that we looked at. 1, during the COVID-19, did you receive or did you have experienced a fall in demand for products and services? 60% of small firms said yes, vis-a-vis 42% of large firms. Second question, Did you experience a decrease in supply of inputs that you receive? 53% of small farms said yes, vis-a-vis 36% of large farms. The final question, do you face a cash problem? Do you really face this situation, financial issues, the cash availability or the restrictions? Of course, 64% of small farms says yes, vis-a-vis 46% of large farms. You know what I want to say, Serge, that this kind of fact-based, evidence-based information is very important for the government, for them to come up with effective policy actions to support these smaller farms, which a lot of the fair trade producers are one of them. How to support most effectively and most speedily these small firms. And I think I stop here now, and I'd like to touch upon the implication to the government policy making related to this question a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Miho, and thanks again, and congratulations to the great UNCTAD team for the very robust work and that you do, which is very helpful as well as a movement. You know that we were born at the same time as a movement, and you as an international organization, and we are very pleased that we count on such a robust research partner. Thanks for that. Erinch, from the World Fair Trade Organization, how would you describe the main lesson learned that we learn?
Thanks, Sergi. I mean, in a word, inequality. In a word, power disparities. I think what COVID did is it just put a magnifying lens on all the things that were broken already in our economic model. Our model that exploits people, exploits planet, and we were already driving off a cliff on ecological collapse and on spiraling inequality. And I think it just sped up this process. But during the midst of the pandemic, what we saw was also that these alternatives, and I agree with you, they shouldn't be alternatives, but for the sake of this conversation, alternatives, that they are viable, they are desirable, and there's something special that happens within them when a crisis hits. So in our community of social enterprises, there was an amazing solidarity. When we look at the mainstream business world, and the distinction I want to draw between sort of the social enterprise fair trade world and the mainstream business world is the mainstream business world primarily set up to inject capital into companies and make decisions that maximize the extraction of that capital back out. I mean, one way or another, that's kind of the DNA of the core international corporate model. When we contrast with that model, what we saw was we had a huge amount of solidarity among the members of the World Fair Trade Organization. Our global wholesaler members, 92% of them provided extra financial flexibility to the fair trade producers. This was at a moment when their counterparts were slashing orders, negotiating down prices, and we're trying to push the risks and the costs onto producers because they're set up to minimize their own risk. They're set up to maximize their own margins. And when you set up a business as an alternative to that, with social value and mission at the heart of it, you get a whole different range of practices, you get a whole different range of impacts. And that really came through along with the huge amount of commitment to suppliers, communities, its own workers. There were far lower rates of workers being made redundant across the board, for instance. So this additional sort of commitment. The other thing that we saw was that the resilience was actually higher. I mean, we are suffering as a community. This is difficult times. Imagine operating an enterprise in a slum, in a refugee camp, in an incredibly marginalized part of the world, and you're trying to make it work in this difficult commercial landscape. But that solidarity means that when we compare a fair trade social enterprise with a mainstream SME, they are 4 times more resilient. Not because they make more money, but because they support each other more, because they persist more, because they persevere when times get tough, because they're not there to asset strip and minimize risk and maximize return. They're there to serve a particular social purpose. So for us, that really came through. And I think the fact that these alternatives are viable, desirable, as well as being truly needed in times of crisis was the main takeaway point for 2020 for me.
Excellent. So that was so Miho calls on us to be prudent and to say, of course, let's of course make sure that well, first of all, priority for the pandemic to end as soon as possible. Let's take stock. We need to maybe do the debate again, and what are the final, let's say, lessons learned. But already I see a lot of very interesting insights already that give inspiration for the future. So I'm now gonna move on to the next second question, and I'm just telling the audience to just be patient, that you will have the chance to ask questions for sure, and we will speak out your questions. And as a reminder, you can already type questions for clarification that you may have, or comments on the chat box of Facebook and YouTube where you're following this debate, and we'll read them out right after the next set of questions, so the second and final. But now, still, let me ask a question myself to the panelists. I'm gonna be changing the order, and I'm gonna start with Lisa this time. And so, Lisa, we've seen all these reflections on lessons learned. We call it alternatives, call it time machines, call it time capsules, but we realize that there is a transformation that needs to happen, or a transition. Now, can it be done alone by the market or by private sector actors, or do we need as well the buy-in and the cooperation of governments? And if so, what is that we need for governments to do, in your view, to help us move in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Serge, because I think as social enterprises, fair trade enterprises, struggle to recover from the pandemic, it is important that government support that process of inclusive recovery and building back fairer. And I think one of the most important acts that government can do is to put in place policies as well as programs to recognize and support social enterprises and fair trade enterprises as transformational partners of the poor in inclusive recovery and building back fairer. And let me just give some examples. In the Philippines, we have been pushing for a poverty reduction through social entrepreneurship bill to become a law to support the development and growth of social enterprises in the Philippines, but that hasn't been successful. And given the pandemic, we are now pushing that the poverty reduction through social entrepreneurship bill becomes a priority law, to support the recovery and as well as the process of building back better given the pandemic. And in that law, there are some features I think that are very important in relation to what government can do, specific provisions. Like, for example, social enterprises, because they're hybrid organizations, they need both grants in order for them to have resources for the capacity building of the poverty sectors that they serve, for example, but they also need enterprise financing in the form of non-collateralized loans with a guarantee fund pool. And given the pandemic, I think zero interest loans are actually very important. Second, the government can actually be a market for social enterprise products, and they can provide preferential procurement provisions, and then also provide tax credits so that they are able to incentivize the practice of sustainable consumption and production systems that social enterprises and fair trade enterprises are doing. We also are actually involved in the pushing for a set of guidelines for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains in ASEAN and in the Philippines. And I think these are guidelines that we have evolved to support food security, resilience, women's empowerment in agricultural value chain development. And I think these kinds of guidelines could help to incentivize the practices that enable social enterprises and fair trade enterprises to develop and grow given the pandemic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So that was interesting. I heard taxation, public access to finance. These are all very interesting levers for change. Louise, how do you see it from the organic agriculture organizations and the role of governments?
Well, thanks for the question. And I also wanted to thank Lisa for your suggestions already. And I think Lisa, you bring up excellent ideas. And I want to add an important thing to that, and that means coherence of the policies. Because all these things that you say, even if they are introduced, if some other policies are not been taken away, they will have little effect. So we're talking about coherence of policies, and I think that is very, very important. And that is because we live in a very funny and strange world, but currently it is financially more advantageous to harm the environment and exploit people and negatively affect their health actually than it is to protect and enhance our natural resources and strive for well-being of our society. So it's really crazy that we actually accept that these negative effects of our agriculture and food systems and the value chains you've been talking about, they are just taken for granted as a trade-off on the society. So we're talking about externalities here that we allow entrepreneurs to produce from which others are suffering. And just as we said already in the beginning, in the pandemic, the poorest are suffering, but also these externalities of production are most of the time put on the back of the poorest. So I would like to suggest, and I need your support for that, Sergi, indeed, that we look at our production system through a lens of true or full cost accounting.
It's on the screen.
Thanks a lot. So this is very, very important because currently we do pay the price, but at some other point. So if I go to the counter and buy a bread, I pay way more than only there at the counter. I not pay only for the bread at the bakery, but I also have paid already because there are subsidies going to the production of the grains. I'm also paying because there are subsidies used for cleaning up, for instance, our water, which is being polluted by the production of those grains. And I'm suffering through my health. So I'm now counting 4 times. That's ridiculous. But it looks like those prices are maybe cheap, but eventually they come at a high cost. So I am suggesting that we are look at our production systems through full cost accounting lenses, so that we can make externalities visible and therewith also influence the narrative. So I'm not suggesting here that we should do the accounting as if we were accountants, but I'm offering a perspective that helps us looking at our production system that actually then also makes policies coherent, because only then we can come to the transformation to an envisaged future in which food system policies do incentivize the production for public goods and actually disincentivize those public bads from which we are suffering altogether now. And so that also means that there are incentives for food system actors to optimize the public goods. And yes, they can strive for profits, but that's not the core of their business. And that's what Erinch already said before. So that also product prices integrate positive and negative externalities. And I think that is where we should go to if you want to go to a transformational future. What is interesting is that some governments do this already. So it sounds now very theoretical, but it's not, it's happening. We know, for instance, that there are carbon credits. We also know that some governments put a levy, for instance, on the use of pesticides. And the money for that, they again use for doing research in organic agriculture. There are other systems out there. So we can actually help making that transformation if we look at our production systems, not at the angle of only economic gains, but if we take all the externalities in account. And what we are doing as IFOAM-Organics International, we bring politicians who want to look at their country, at their production systems in this way together. And therefore, we have organized the Food Policy Forum for Change, in which policymakers and high officials come together to actually already see how their countries can move to more sustainability. So again, there's also a glance of hope, as we already saw in the first round, because people are working on this and we can move towards more sustainability if we just put on other glasses. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Louise. That was very interesting. I like the glasses metaphor. And what an excellent bridge that you've made to the next intervention. So we've talked about good practices and motivated governments. So we'd like to hear now from Mr. Legarda. Can you tell us what Ecuador has done actually to promote these alternatives, and what are the plans that your country has in relation to this in the coming years?
Well, thanks again, Sergi, and also thank you to the panelists, to Lisa, and everyone who has, Louise especially, and Marie, who has also raised the case of Philippines and the international case about going forward with practices on the fair trade. On Ecuador, I would say that we have a long story now from the public policy for fair trade in Ecuador started back in 2012, and it has come together along all these years. At the beginning, it was well supported and founded by the government, but since in the last years there's been some fiscal problems, the support for this have decreased, and that it's one of the challenges that the thing has in our countries. But the good thing is that we have a private sector that it's really compromised with fair trade. And there are a lot of organizations that truly believes in this and support and promote this and are working day on day on promoting not only from the private perspective in terms of the standards that they set for the trade, but also in pressing the government to keep forward the actions regarding fair trade and how we can make an value-added policy out of that to benefit the producers. So I would say that in the main challenge that we have and the main recommendation that the government can do, and a government official as me can do, is definitely to strengthen our institutional frameworks, our regulatory and institutional frameworks, with all that this means together. And that mainly means that we need to internalize in each country the public policy that surrounds the fair trade. This has at the same time, this has two main aspects: the one for the producers and the one from the consumer side. In terms of the producers, Ecuador, what it's been doing is promoting the catalog of certifications, both international certifications that are mostly well known at the world, but also national certifications. And this is important because it's also bringing conscience to the national market about how important is fair trade. And even though developing countries have I would say a less important market in terms of the amount, but are every day are growing in terms of the importance and the conscience that this brings to the people. And this is a good thing. And this is would not happen if wouldn't be also considerations from public policy to bring these aspects to the people inside. That's why we have national certifications also for the national market about organic, there's also another one from fair trade that it's only national certification, and this goes along with the same standards from international certifications. Then there's another one to make also notice on the consumer side, which I would say is the most important, because the efforts that a government can do and that producers and associations can do need to be aligned with also the conscience of the consumers. And this is something that needs to be promoted every day. I think World Fair Trade Organization here, and along with other organizations, make a great work in doing this around the world. Of course, there's not enough that a government such as the government of Ecuador, a small country, can do. But with the support of international organizations and international governments, this can be also done to bring the consumer the awareness and recognition that the fair trade needs. And this has been a long way. Right now, the fair trade and market in the world has more importance than it has been in the last years. The amounts, even though there are not specific, but it's about over 10 billion millions in trade of fair trade products now at these days. And what we have done here in Ecuador is also bringing some aspects that could help people notice that the fair trade is important and what the benefits are for this. For example, Quito, the capital of Ecuador, has been named a city for a fair trade city. And actually, we were going to have an event last year that was going to be held in Quito about with the World Fair Trade Organization. Of course, the pandemic's changed everything, and this was postponed, hopefully for next year. Right now, but this is something that calls the attention of the people both nationally and internationally. But I would say it's needed, this support, especially in the developed markets, because the product doesn't arrive directly to the consumer there. For example, one of our mainly export products, banana, we have a lot of banana certificated firms that sell in Europe, in the United States, in China, in Russia, and a lot of places in the world. And in some places, we have some problems because as we have intermediate parties, such as supermarkets, such as dealers, some of them we have trouble recognizing that there's also an effort from producers. There's also an effort from firms down in Ecuador, in this case, and this would be the case of any developed countries which sells kind of these products, that have to also invest in terms of the certification and what it implies in having the certification, in having organic products, in having well-paid salaries. But we've been having some problems with some supermarkets in Europe, for example, that they push towards a less level of price in the final product. And this is something that it's implied not recognizing the efforts that the firms, the country, the producers are doing, and the need for a fair trade in this case. And this is something that we definitely need to show up and need to push forward to make the people notice, to make the consumer notice that there's also an important terms to I would say is not the right term, but it's a price to pay for this, and it needs to be internalized. It's something in the way that Lisa was saying, that Louise was saying, that we need to internalize this, and the consumers need to be also aware of this awareness that these products need to have, so that they can also transmit this to supermarkets and the whole supply chain, and we don't have to deal kind of in a long way with only the force of the supermarket, which is unbalanced, I would say, and pressing always pushing down the prices, while the costs of having a fair trade system and good salaries and it's not in the same level. So I would say that's one of the main challenges that we have faced in the last couple of years, and it'll be important also to strengthen this, not only in terms of the governments that we can do, but internationally, bringing together all the efforts.
Yes, thank you very much. And I find it interesting that in the end, both you and Louise were talking about who pays for the price of sustainable consumption and production, right? I mean, you were presenting it different ways. Louise was saying, is it the companies that actually sell products and make money out of it, or is it society? Because in the end, externality costs, polluted rivers it's a high cost for society. So who pays for that? And then you were saying, Mr. Legarda, yeah, indeed, is it the small producer cooperative, or is it the supermarket that pays as well? So I think it's a very interesting topic, which I'm happy that it comes up. If I can add, just we sometimes find that the discussions on sustainable consumption and production don't really look at the price. It's a bit of a taboo. It's not the main topic, whereas actually who pays for what is actually, and the power in the end of supply chains is a key lens as well, right? Another lens where I think we believe supply chains should be looked at as well. Anyway, building on that, so thanks very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Miho again. You are in touch with all governments, basically, so many governments. So what do you see as some good practices or some ideas that you can share on the role of governments in this recovery from COVID?
Thank you, Serge, and thank you everyone for this great information and ideas and experiences that you have shared. And I think it is extremely thought-provoking and such a great input for coming up with a new policy in, to support this fair trade movement and in smaller scale producers and business operators. Again, I just want to bring in some facts that's, because we basically base analysis on the facts and data. And again, on this portal that I mentioned that we released recently, we also have this updated data on the types of the pandemic-related policy measures that have been enacted by many governments in support of small and medium enterprises. And there are several kind of types, but if you put them all together, you actually see that over 90%, 90%, were related to financial support measures, like in support of debt financing, in support of covering loans and guarantees and tax reliefs and so on and so forth. And I think it is quite a good news, of course, because according to our survey of biotrade in terms of the COVID-19 impact, majority of people said that the most useful type of support would be financial incentives and liquidity support, like grants and subsidies and so on and so forth, as well as tax relief. So it seems like so far the measures that had been used by the government are meeting with the demand for such measures for small producers. However, of course, there are two things that we want to say. First, we were just focusing on the measures that were used in support of small farms and small producers and small businesses. Now, if you compare the entire size of the policy measures that were used for the small businesses vis-a-vis a much wider kind of the package of support measures, in very many cases, the bigger portion actually went to the bigger farms or bigger economic activities. And the support to the SMEs and MSMEs happened to stay in the bracket of smaller portions. So this is something that we really have to bring attention of many governments to see that, look, if you think about not only the statistics, but the actual economic activities, and economic activities were operated by human beings and people, majority of them are small-scale operators. So the most effective type of policy measures, if you're looking for, then you should really pay much greater attention to the small, in support of small businesses. That was the first point. Now, the second point, if we are looking at building back better and building back fairer, it's providing the financial support just to mitigate the current and immediate challenge faced by fair trade producers and businesses is important, but it's not necessarily forward-looking. So for the forward-looking, I think Mr. Legarda and others have pointed out on a very important lesson that now we also have to look into to cultivate the consumer awareness, consumer demand for those products that are produced sustainably, serviced sustainably, and so on and so forth. Because this, the environmental benefits and the impacts of their purchasing decision, they should be informed more clearly that their purchasing decision actually contributes to inclusive and equitable policy, equitable economic recovery. And just the final point on what Lisa said about sustainable public procurement. We think it is also quite a viable policy measures for two reasons. One, because this measure can be quite cheap to implement for the government, because we are not talking about additional something. We are talking about sort of doing what to do with existing policy measure to which the budget is already existing, and how we can use it to support sustainably produced and sustainably serviced and fair kind of products. You know, the public procurement represents, for the OECD government, is about 12% of GDP. And for developing countries, it's up to 30, on average, sorry, it's not up to, on average, 30% of the GDP. So it is a huge, huge market. And a sort of institutionalizing demand for sustainably produced products from the government can probably prompt the private sector to really have a good idea that embracing social and economic sustainability of production and business actually makes a very good business sense. And this is good for producers, this is good for consumers, something that is obvious to us, but going through this economic system, I think it would make much, sort of the better and impactful message to everyone in the economic system. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Miho. So now is your turn, Erinch, in terms of the role of governments. How do you see? Is
Sure.
the market will save us? Will the market take us to heaven, or we need actually active public policies?
I mean, clearly we need active public policies, and it's such a privilege to be on with the Vice Minister from Ecuador, because I think that they're such a great example of a progressive-minded and active government that has a constitution that includes a lot of these issues of fair trade and sustainable production. It's absolutely a fantastic example, I think, for a lot of other governments. But overall, you mentioned earlier, Sergi, the topic of this being a time capsule, thinking of ourselves as a time capsule. So for a second, I want to invite everyone here to just picture the year 2040. We're making decisions now, governments are making decisions now that will shape the economy of 2040. Now, the enterprises, the businesses that populate the economy of 2040, they have not been born yet. The average company lasts for about 10 to 13 years, depending on which study you look at. So those businesses have not been born yet. They will be shaped partly by government policy, but partly by the business ecosystem that governments support. So everything from financial markets to public procurement, to accounting rules, to regulations, to taxes, all of these things will decide the shape and makeup of the economy of 2040. So we don't always have to start with where we are today and say, how do we make it less bad? We can also envision what we want tomorrow and say, what do we do today to create that different reality tomorrow? And if we look at that through the lens of these viable alternatives, these innovative proofs of concept of what the future could look like, then it takes us into a very different level of conversation. Suddenly we're not thinking, how do we adjust today's market and today's economy? It allows us to be a little bit more ambitious. And I say ambitious in a tongue-in-cheek way, because it's not, if saving our planet and saving humanity shouldn't feel ambitious, but the current models of business, trade, and economic policy, they're no longer fit for purpose. It's an economy of the 20th century that we're trying to fix up, but it's like an old car. It's breaking down, and we need to build a different car that's going to take us to that destination that we need to get to. And I think particularly, and I can speak most authoritatively from the world of the social enterprise models that have sprung up around the world, they're working in a business ecosystem that isn't designed for them. They're working with legal forms that don't exist. They're working with accounting rules that aren't designed for them. Critically, they're working in financial markets that are designed to punish them. Those financial markets are not designed to reward them, because the financial markets are putting capital into the businesses that promise the most money back to the financial market. And if you're going up to a financial market and saying, look, my priority is my community, it's agroecology, it's making sure that the rivers are clean, it's making sure that people are lifted out of poverty, I'm not going to make dividends to you my main priority. Suddenly you have a big mismatch there. So and I think Lisa's point around having non-collateralized loans and guarantees from governments is absolutely critical. But I think overall we need to think of this as a package of an economy we're trying to create. And my last sort of, plea is to look at things like industry policy. governments know how to do this when they decide, particularly in developed countries, but developing countries as well, that they want to create a biotech industry. They know the policy levers. They know the incentives. They know the grants. They know the public procurement aspects. They know the access to finance they need to provide. They know the training they need to inject into those sectors. They know how to decide and calibrate the shape of an economy based on particular sectoral choices. What we're saying is take that lens and make it deliberate about the enterprise models that will also populate your economies of the future. And then you've got an economy that is full of enterprises that are ready to do the heavy lifting of sustainable development.
Thank you. What an inspiring discussion. And I'm taking notes that we are talking about at least about 3 types of lenses already. So this metaphor seems to be actually the thing of the day. We've heard from Louise about the full cost accounting and the externality cost. We've heard from Daniel Legarda as well about who pays the price. Is it supermarket? Is it the small cooperative? And then Erinch is also encouraging us to then switch again and change the lens and looking at sustainable consumption and production from the point of view of the companies behind those sustainable consumption and production patterns, right? So not so much at the goods themselves, but who is behind. It's actually, if I may add an additional comment, it's actually some of the problems that public procurement policies around the world face is actually precisely that. That is typically the obstacle. It's becoming now quite, with the SDG 12, quite easy to promote the purchase of sustainably produced goods. It's getting traction. It is way more difficult for governments at national level or local level to put in place proactive policies to support specific types of business models. Because often the rules are, and the lawyers always say, oh, we do not know if it's possible or not. And that's why we need courageous governments like Ecuador at national level, but also my hometown. I'm proud of my city of Barcelona in Spain, that also, for example, has very proactive policies to support the local social enterprises in the city. And they go as far as they are legally allowed to actually have a positive, let's say, agenda in support of social and solidarity economy actors, as they are an important part of the economy, and they believe it's part of the ecosystem that needs to be promoted. Anyway, so that. Yeah.
Sergi, I'm going to jump in with a question myself, if that's okay. I was going to ask
Louise, go ahead.
Louise, actually, because it's interesting to compare the fair trade and organic movements a little bit, and changes happening at different moments, and the two are so connected. But Louise, are you seeing more activity at national level policies or at local level policies? Because a lot of the energy in fair trade and certainly in social enterprise that I see is happening at local level and not necessarily always at national level.
That's an excellent question, Erinch. And I was about to tell that. So local governments have way more power than they think. So first of all, this is an encouragement. Use your power. And also local governments seem to be more stable over time in what they want to reach, whereas national governments might change the one day to the other with entirely different rules. So we have a couple of excellent examples. And I am happy that Lisa is here because I can only praise many municipalities in the Philippines where the mayor has declared, of course with the support of the community, the full municipality organic. Full stop. Market, school canteens, hospitals, of course the farmers, everything's organic. The full community is behind it. And they really understand the benefits, because I did mention the hospitals, but it is so much related to health. So these things you can do at a local level, And fortunately, all these mayors are also connected. So there's a thriving network of mayors in Southeast Asia who have all declared their municipalities being organic. This network is called ALCOA. And we talk about now a good 250 of those municipalities. Just think about the direct reach that they have. But we also have big cities, for instance, in Europe, Copenhagen, which is the capital of Denmark. The government has decided that the canteens are organic. And there is now, instead of a race to the bottom, which we very often see, there's now a race to the top. And the canteens are competing with each other who has the most percentage of organic food. And the interesting thing is that the food has not been, did not become more expensive. Actually, they have found ways to have less waste, to work directly with farmers. And so this again has also been an enormous impulse for farmers in Denmark to transition to organic agriculture. So your question, Erinch, is wonderful, and it shows that cities can do so much. And lastly, I want just to praise the city of Quito again, because I think that in Quito there is so much opportunity because of your the way you use your green spaces and have the community participating in that and producing their own safe food, that there are also ways for government to help the less, let's say, affluent people who have less income to also get food from community gardens. So there's a lot to do. And I also appreciate what you earlier said, Erinch. These are the building blocks, the diversity of building blocks where we can build up when we talk about transformation to sustainable, to a more sustainable future.
May I butt in? I think it's a timely thing to say, but because I think, Louise, you were talking about local initiatives in the Philippines promoting organic agriculture at the municipal level. Actually, we are involved in a pioneering effort with the Department of Agriculture in the Philippines, because they actually have a new program called Organic Connect, and they are supposed to be setting up organic hubs in all regions in the country, and they're going to be piloting this with partners, no? And the good thing is, we have actually been successful in having a memorandum of agreement between the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia and the Department of Agriculture to integrate social entrepreneurship into the capacity building programs for Department Agriculture stakeholders and their partners in Organic Connect. No? So I think that is going to, I mean, we have to wait and see what really happens, right? But I think it's happening at a time that the local initiatives are ongoing. And I think this initiative at the national level is going to boost that a bit. No? The other thing that I wanted to emphasize also is at the ASEAN level, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations level, we are in the process of already discussing with the ASEAN Secretariat the possibility of putting in place, guidelines for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains that actually are not only about women's economic empowerment, but it's really about resilience, about food security, about sustainable consumption and production systems in agricultural value chain development. And I think there's an openness on the part of governments at the moment because of the vulnerabilities opened up by the pandemic, to go into a rethinking of the future. And we're hoping, it also remains to be seen if we will do progress in this, but it's interesting that I think there's an opening up in ASEAN for these guidelines for transformation partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm reminding the audience that you can write in the chat box of Facebook or YouTube or the channel any question. We've seen actually somehow we saw some messages pass here. I saw in my screen, which I saw that they were interesting comments. But if you have specific questions, let us know. I see that there is one question. Louise, I think it's more to you. Andres, I do not know from which country, but I know that that he comes from the country of YouTube, let's say, not Facebook, but he comes from the YouTube community. Andres, thanks for following. Has a question for you, so which is how can organic, how can strengthen the link, the cooperation between organic and other initiatives that are not organic, but that are about sustainable agriculture?
Mm-hmm. So thanks a lot for this question, Andres. For every farmer, regardless in what system they are farming currently, they all farm in the same context. And so that's what they have in common. And some farmers already took the chance to go to an organic production, but that also maybe was a risk for them, or maybe they had a motivation to do that. Some farmers are not yet organic, but we're really happy to also welcome them. And I think they all should have the opportunity to do good and contribute to the good. And that's the point I wanted to make earlier. The current context and the current economic system in many countries is such that when a farmer wants to do good, whatever scale or whatever pace, they actually get punished. And why? Because they are internalizing costs that other farmers can externalize. So what is very important for every farmer, for every producer, is the context in which they work. So I also appreciated a lot the earlier remark of Miho, that it's really important that consumers are aware on how they can spend their money in a more sustainable way. But consumers can only do that much. Also, they live in this context of our rules. And sometimes we in the organic sector get even an how should I say that? People get a little bit angry with me sometimes when I talk about this full cost accounting, because then they said, so you want to make my food more expensive? I said, no, that's not the case. I want to make sure that everybody has access to healthy food and that we actually reflect the price that's behind it, and also that nobody is literally sitting on the cost of the externalities. So what all farmers have in common is the context in which they produce. And I think what we all as citizens have in common, that we also have a voice and a vote in how to shape that context for a more sustainable future.
Yes, thank you very much, Louise. Do we have other questions or reactions actually to each other, or would you like to say, I would have, what did you mean with this?
I've got a question actually for Daniel. I mean, Vice Minister, we all look at with admiration at some of the leadership that I think Ecuador has taken, but I assume that these actions, they're not really political. I mean, everybody agrees with fair trade. Everybody would like more organic. Everybody would like more social enterprise. Has that been the experience, that this is something that is embraced at national level, and it's not necessarily a party political issue anymore?
It's an important question, definitely, Erinch, and thank you for that, because I was going to jump in with these questions, and now with the other one that is giving us from one of the viewers right now. At the beginning, it was taken kind of in a political context, especially because these had other elements taken into account of other social and political aspects, and this was included in the same package. At the beginning, some part of the population took it partly policy, but then once the policies started and the benefits of it started to see, and the companies and the business people here also saw this as this is a good business for everyone, not just for highlighting that the farmers need to have a better income or to have a better way of life and a fair salary and everything like that, but it's also good for my business as well. So it started to see this as a whole view, and this was important. This one as an important step took by the society, I would say. And even though that Ecuador has been changed now because we have recently had elected government, and definitely it's a new view of pro-market that is coming into way, if you can say so. But definitely the aspects about fair trade, about the importance of organic products, and all that surrounds these important topics are now within the society, within the business community, within the farmers, within the public policy of the government. So I can definitely say for sure that this is going to continue. Of course, there have been less support in terms of the fiscal affection that Ecuador has had. The budget of the government has been affected a lot, but we're still trying to give support everything in every way that we can. And this connects with also the last questions that you were talking about, which is who does more, the local governments or the overall government? I would say that in the case of Ecuador, a small country, I would say it's a work of both of them. Some municipalities, such as Quito, and for example, Riobamba, which is another city in the center of the country, have a lot of active actions regarding a fair trade and a more sustainable way of producing food within the cities as well. But the government has also taken a lot of a part important in this, because we couldn't have what we have internal in the country without being at international markets. The connection with international markets, it's essential on this. And that brings the other question that Cyril Sign is giving us in Facebook. That is, some experts suggest that fair trade encourages inefficiency within supply chains. I would say that for some products it might be, but at the end, in the path that we are going forward, this is becoming more normal, and that's good for the whole population and for the world. For example, for the products of Ecuador, bananas, cocoa, flowers, which is not edible in some cases, but it's also fair trade for many of it, and many others, vegetables and more. The efficiency of the international markets, it's a key aspect in all the working system. I mean, we couldn't have the sustainability we are trying to work and that we have in some cases without the connection with international markets and international supply chains as well. Of course, with these challenges that we have signaled before, and agree with Louise on this, externalize the cost of it, because that's something to signal, of course. But definitely there's connections with this, and I would say it doesn't encourage inefficiency, but of course we need to make this a thing that it's every day has more awareness in the consumers all around the world. Right now, there has been an effect that in specific markets and among these countries, specific niches of market are the only ones that consume organic products or fair trade products. But I think there's a challenge that we also need to bring, that is to amplify this and notice to other people in the same countries that there are also fair trade products that you can consume and that you can, and it doesn't have to be at a much higher price than the other one. But we need to amplify this. This is the challenge, I would say, for the future, along with the ones that you have just signaled.
Excellent. Thank you very much. As it always happens, it kicks off one question leads to another. So now, Miho, I have two questions for you, actually. So we have somebody from YouTube that is asking about the role of trade policy in relation to organic and fair trade. If you can elaborate maybe a bit on that. And then the second would be from actually Lisa, about the support for social enterprises by governments, not just for small and medium enterprises, towards inclusive recovery and building back fairer. I hope I have explained it well. Maybe, Lisa, you can can you help me really formulate rightly your question? I apologize.
Yeah, well, maybe it's just a response to Miho, I think, because I think it's true that many governments have allocated a lot of money for micro, small, and medium enterprises. But as we said, social enterprises and fair trade enterprises are not just, micro, small, and medium enterprises. They're, social mission-driven enterprises, and they are, the partners that we need for building back fairer and better. And my question has to do with the prospects of governments providing some sort of a social enterprise recovery fund, so that these kinds of social enterprises can actually be supported to build back towards inclusive recovery and building back fairer, because we do have that advocacy now in the Philippines and also in Asia, with the WFTO Asia actually, because we believe that unless we're able to assist social enterprises and fair trade enterprises to recover effectively, then we may not be talking about a fairer world in the future.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much for the question. So let me address this first one on, what kind of role can trade policy play? But trade policy is a huge concept, so let me just focus on trade agreements in terms within the multilateral trade framework like WTO, and also like a regional or bilateral free trade agreements. Now, starting with the WTO, I don't want to get into too technical on this, but WTO rule is not so much about the process of how products are produced. They don't really look at it, especially in the framework of so-called technical barriers to trade agreement. It's clearly written that these trade rules are not so much on how products are produced. But of course, as you know, there's a famous case of shrimp turtle, dolphin net, of this, how fish were caught and did it really harm this environment and so on and so forth. And you know very, very well that this remains a very difficult case to come up with a solution. I think the majority still remains that the WTO is not so much about how things are produced. Also, just to give you a bit of the view, not from every developing countries, but some developing countries, on the danger of WTO moving into this direction. They think that there's a risk that this kind of agreement could work against them, against their competitiveness in the international market. For example, there have been a discussion of should a country have to have an independent tariff line on organic product. For example, tomatoes. Do we have just tomato and another line saying organic tomatoes? And do we attach a different tariff rate on, probably much lower tariff rate for organic tomatoes and not organic tomatoes? Developing countries quite many developing countries are quite wary about this issue. And this is related to their challenge facing when they're in commercialization of organic agriculture. And this is the counter question to Louise, basically. There's one thing to produce organically. There's another thing to commercialize their organic products. And in my project in the past, we have been discussing with, especially it was in the Philippines and in Vanuatu and in Laos, producers. Of course, they are aware of the huge and gigantic and growing market opportunities producing the organic products, not only coffee and those things, but everything, fresh fruits and vegetables. But the current situation, like Sergi correctly put it, in the current power balance within the supply chain, they are the ones who are forced to pay for the certification cost. And they say that a lot of producers actually left organic production because they could not make a business sense when they have to pay this organic production, organic certification cost. And basically because of that, they don't think that having a specific focus on the organic products within the tariff line could provide any objective sort of advantage to developing country producers in the agricultural sector. That's one thing. Let me just quickly go for the regional and bilateral free trade agreements. That trend is here in support of fair and sustainable products. Up to now, as you know, that there has been a growing number of regional and free trade agreements. Now, there are over 300 existing at this moment. Out of 300 today, 19 have reference to the use of the promotion of sustainability standards, for example, including organic standards. So some of the FTAs actually start, I think many of them come from the EU and then also some from Canada, actually say that, two parties will cooperate in enhancing a better market access for sustainable products and organic products. One thing we have to say, though, that even there, it remains as a kind of best endeavor, kind of a provision. It doesn't really say that this is the rule and we will reduce tariffs or we will improve the market access. It's more of the agreement to cooperate further for, for the consumer awareness increase and so on and so forth. And that's basically where we are. In summary, we are moving. This issue of fair trade and sustainable production is increasing its weight in trade policy making at multilateral level and the regional and bilateral level, and that's for sure. But how it should be made in a way that it really supports, resource poor farmers or the farmers, small scale farmers, particularly in developing countries. There are still a lot to discuss, and the good ideas coming from you would be much appreciated. To the Marie-Louise, very quickly on the social enterprise recovery support. We don't have the data for it, and one reason is because we cannot identify the good data source for it to do the collect the information fairly on the on a consistent basis from different countries. Probably it's easier to collect from developed countries, but not necessarily from developing countries. But this actually gives us a very good idea to actually pay attention to the social enterprises within SMEs and see how, to collect the important data. Just very quick, I really don't want to take too much time, but I have a question, Sergi. on the thing that, the point that you are saying about this consumer awareness and the supply chain, and it's really the question of who pays the highest cost, who receives the biggest profit in the supply chain of sustainable and fair and organic products and services. In my project, it was only possible way was to do is that within the supply chain doing the input-output table. Really following from one actor to another, how much they receive for what product, and when it goes to another level, what is the value added, and what's the value added in the next period, and so on and so forth. And obviously for the coconuts, for the organic vegetables, and we looked at, it is the retailers who receive the biggest benefit by selling things, saying that these are sustainable and organic. Or it is the global brands who receive the biggest share, saying that these are sustainable and organic. I think this market, Erinch has all this experience in avoiding these things, but this actually is also another reason why quite many producers in developing countries are wary of the idea of having sustainability standards, because they feel like they will be ripped off again by major global retailers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I have the painful job of having to wrap up such an interesting discussion at this moment, but for respect of the audience that we've said that we need to conclude, I need to wrapping up. Let me just, without answering, and before I give the floor, I will give the floor to the panelists now to say one word that they will remember from this panel. And I will start on the order that we started the first time. So starting with Mr. Legarda. But I think in preparation of that, just one lesson or something that I have learned, if I can start, is also that we talked about lenses. And then, Miho, you've made me think that it's not only the lens, you need data. Because it's not only nice to put yourself the externality cost lens, you then need to calculate and show the differences, right? You've talked about value sharing. So it's nice to put the lens of power, but how does it translate into actually who gets what? So I guess that it's an important point for attention, that in order to inform future policies, we need more data to support these lenses, because it's not only a philosophical thing. We need to show data. So anyway, this was my takeaway. I would like now to ask then each of you to say one word that you will remember from this debate. And I will start with Mr. Legarda.
Thank you, Sergi. Such an interesting conversation. It's not going to be one, but it's two. I would say it's new normal, because what we have talked here, it's something that has, it's like, if I can compare it to something, it's like when we talk to e-commerce. E-commerce was happening already, but with the pandemics, it all got accelerated. Something similar is happening about fair trade and all that surrounds it. It was happening before, but right now, with all that has been happening, I think it's accelerating and will be accelerating in the next years. And we need to be prepared in all levels: consumers, governments, actors, private actors, and NGOs, of course.
Thank you very much. Louise, what would be your word for today?
I would say that we have heard that transformation is not only possible, it's happening. And so if we look carefully, we can build on that for a better future. And that's also how we can build back fairer. Or I maybe would say not build back, go on.
Excellent, great. Thanks for the good vibes and hopeful message. Lisa, what would be your word to summarize today's discussion?
Well, I think social entrepreneurship, because I think it's not just about social enterprises, but social enterprises working with governments, working with the private sector, and working with institutions like UNCTAD and IFOAM, and in order for us to build back fairer.
Excellent, thank you, Lisa. What about you, Miho?
It's very, very difficult. Just the word that came to my mind is operationalization. We have the great ideas. How are we going to operationalize them? That's the most important thing at this moment, I think. And that requires multi-stakeholder collaboration, including us, international organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Erinch?
Mine is choice. Choose the alternative in policy. Choose fair trade enterprises, social enterprises, organic cooperatives. Have a fund, have a COVID recovery fund that is dedicated to them. Be deliberate about those choices and don't be agnostic about the kind of businesses that you're fostering. And a quick one-sentence answer to Miho's question as well, Sergi, which I think is really important. I lead an organization that has a product label only for social enterprises. So the guaranteed fair trade label cannot be used by corporates. It cannot be used by supermarkets, others. It's only for social enterprises. The system is developed explicitly and exclusively for social enterprises, which makes it very different in terms of costs, etc. as well. But there are multiple in the fair trade world as well as other movements, and I just want to underline that this exists. So to everyone listening, support these alternatives as consumers and push your governments as citizens.
Excellent. What a great way to end. So I would like to thank everybody, each and every panelist, for the great contributions. I think that I leave this panel with the good feeling of not being able to have discussed everything, but it's a good thing. As Miho was saying, maybe this will open up possibilities for cooperation. Some next steps have already been mentioned. Louise has mentioned the Food Policy Forum for Change. Mr. Legarda, you've mentioned actually this postponed event also on fair trade, which will hopefully happen next year in Quito, which we look forward to. And hopefully there will be other occasions where we can continue this in the spirit of what Miho has said, of working together to address these things. Now, there is one more fun and short-term thing to do, which is to enjoy World Fair Trade Day tomorrow. It is, as I said, despite the difficult situation, still there are many people that are suffering from the COVID pandemic. It's nevertheless a good moment to join forces, to re-energize. I finished this panel with a lot of energy, inspired by all the changes that is happening already. So this has given me energy, and energy to celebrate as well with you World Fair Trade Day tomorrow. So thanks everybody, each panelist, our co-organizer, World Fair Trade Organization, and all the signatories of the Build Back Fairer campaign as well, and look forward to working together with you to make all this operationalized and a reality, stronger reality every year. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you to everyone.